Before Mass begins, the server must dress the altar in preparation. He first removes the cover from the altar. He places the altar cards in their proper positions, the center card in the center. He lights the candles, which at low Mass are only 2. On the credence table, there should be cruets containing water and wine for Mass, a lavabo dish and towel, a bell for the server to ring during Mass, and if communion is to be distributed to the faithful, a server's paten. The altar missal is placed on a missal stand, which is set square on the epistle side of the altar. The missal should be placed on the altar closed, with the pages facing towards the center of the altar. He should also set the ribbons to their appropriate places. The altar is now dressed and ready for Mass. Prior to saying Mass, the priest should spend a little time in prayer to properly recollect himself. The priest then goes to the sacristy to vest for Mass. The vestments should be laid out in the sacristy before Mass in the opposite order in which they are put on. First the chasuble, then the stole, then the maniple, the cincture, the alb, and the amice. When the priest enters the sacristy to begin vesting, he first washes his hands. The priest then approaches the vesting table. He should be clothed in black shoes and cassock and remove his watch and any other jewelry. He may also remove his fascia. The priest then prepares the chalice for Mass. The cross at the base of the chalice should be facing forward. If the chalice does not have a cross, the priest should note some image or marking on the chalice as a reference point. This is so that the same side of the chalice will always be used when pouring in the water and wine and when drinking the precious blood and the ablutions. The purificator is laid over the top of the chalice, with the cross in the center and the ends draped over each side. The paten is laid on top of the purificator with a large host placed in the center. The pall covers the paten. The chalice veil is then draped over the whole chalice so that the front part of the chalice is completely veiled. Usually there will be a decorative design on the front of the chalice veil, which should face forward. The corporal should have been folded and ironed previously in the following manner. The corporal is first folded into thirds, the bottom third folded up and the top third down. Then in thirds again, first the right side and then the left. The folded corporal is then placed inside the burse with the open ends facing out. The burse is laid on top of the chalice with the closed fold towards the front and the open end towards the back. He begins with the amice, taking it by the cords, and kissing the cross in the center. He then draws his right hand over his head, touches the amice to his head briefly. He wraps the amice around his neck so that the collar is completely covered. He crosses the right cord over the left, draws them around his back, and ties them in front. He tucks in the edges of the amice as necessary to cover the collar. He next takes the alb. He first puts in the right sleeve, followed by the left. The server may assist the priest to make sure the alb falls evenly at his feet. It should cover the cassock completely and hang within a few inches of the floor. The server then presents the cincture, which the priest takes in both hands, and girds himself. He makes a knot in front and pulls it tight leaving the ends hanging at the middle. He then checks to make sure the alb hangs evenly all the way around. The priest then takes the maniple, kisses the cross in the center, and puts it on his left arm. The maniple should be placed on the forearm towards the elbow, but not further. It is secured either with an elastic band or, more traditionally, with a maniple pin. The priest then takes the stole and kisses the cross in the center. He places it over his neck with the cross at the center. He then crosses the ends in front, right over left. He secures each end with the cincture, making 2 loops on either side, through which he then puts the ends of the cincture, allowing them to hang on either side. The priest then puts on the chasuble, assisted by the server. As he puts his head through, once the priest is fully vested, he picks up the chalice with his left hand and turns it so that the veiled side is facing away from him. He takes his biretta and covers his head, making sure the middle fin is towards his right. He then places his right hand on top of the burse to steady the chalice. The priest and server both bow their heads to the cross in the sacristy and then proceed to the altar. The server may give the priest holy water at the entrance to the chapel. It is also customary for the server to ring a bell as they enter to alert the people that Mass is beginning. They then proceed to the altar. The priest processes to the altar preceded by the server. If he should pass a tabernacle where the sacrament is reserved, both priest and server turn and genuflect to the Blessed Sacrament. Since the priest is carrying the chalice, he does not uncover his head while genuflecting. When the priest arrives at the foot of the altar where he is to say Mass, he uncovers and gives the biretta to the server who stands on his right. Both then reverence the altar. If the sacrament is reserved in a tabernacle on or immediately behind the altar, the priest genuflects on the floor. The priest then ascends the altar. The server assists by lifting the hem of his alb and cassock. When the priest arrives at the altar, he places the chalice, turning it so that the veiled side faces towards him. He takes the burse with both hands and then removes the corporal with his right hand and places it on the center of the altar in front of him. He then takes the burse with the right hand and sets the burse side. The priest then unfolds the corporal with both hands. He arranges the corporal so that the near edge of the corporal is about an inch from the edge of the altar. He then takes the chalice with the left hand and sets it on the center of the corporal, but far enough back to leave him room to kiss the altar later. He then folds his hands before the breast, turns, and goes to the missal. At the missal, he opens the book with both hands and checks the ribbons to make sure they are set correctly for the Mass. He joins his hands and goes to the center of the altar. He makes a low head bow to the altar cross and then turns by his right to descend. As he turns, he steps a little to his left so as not to turn his back completely to the altar. When he arrives at the foot of the altar, he again reverences the altar. If the sacrament is present, he genuflects, although this genuflection will not be on the floor, but against the first step. He opens and closes his hands as he says, and then straightens and ascends the altar. He takes the rear corners of the chalice veil and removes the veil from the chalice. He then folds the chalice veil, which he lays on the side of the altar. Or he may hand it to the server, and the server can fold the veil. The priest then lays his left hand on the altar, takes the chalice with the right, and sets it to the epistle side. He uncovers the chalice and sets the pall aside, leaning it against the back of the altar or the altar card. He then takes the paten with the right hand and brings it to the center over the corporal. His left hand meets the paten in the center, and holding the paten with both hands at the level of his breast, he lifts his eyes up to the cross and then immediately lowers them. The priest should keep his eyes fixed on the host for the entire duration of this prayer. At the end of the prayer, he lowers the paten to a few inches above the corporal and makes the sign of the cross over the place where he will lay the host. He then tilts the paten towards the center and slides the host onto the corporal at the center of the crease nearest him. The left hand is laid on the altar, and the right hand slides the paten halfway underneath the middle of the corporal on the epistle side. He takes the chalice in the left hand, and with the right hand he wipes out the inside with the purificator and goes to the corner. He places the purificator in the thumb of the left hand and drapes it against the side of the chalice, holding the chalice in the left hand just below the cup. The priest then takes the wine cruet from the server and pours in a sufficient amount of wine, enough that he can conveniently drink it in one swallow. The server presents the water cruet, which the priest blesses as he begins the prayer. He infuses a few small drops of water into the wine as he says the words, It is customary in many places for the priest to make a slight head bow to the server after returning the cruet in recognition of his service. The priest then takes the purificator with the index finger of the right hand and wipes out any stray drops of water from the inside of the chalice. He then sets the chalice near the corporal with the left hand. With the purificator still in his right hand, he joins his hands and finishes the prayer, making a low head bow at the words, The priest then goes to the center, lays the purificator over the exposed part of the paten, with the open folds towards the back and the cross facing himself. He takes the chalice with the right hand and brings it to the center over the corporal, where the left hand meets the chalice at the base. He raises the chalice and recites the entire prayer, Oferimus Tibi, with his eyes lifted up to the cross. At the end of the prayer, he lowers the chalice to a few inches above the corporal and makes the sign of the cross over the place where he will lay the chalice. The right hand takes the pall and covers the chalice. Anytime the priest covers and uncovers the chalice, the left hand is laid at the base to steady it. The priest then joins his hands and lays them on the altar as he makes a medium bow of the body, and in this position he recites the prayer in spiritu humilitatis. When the priest says the words, he separates, elevates, and rejoins his hands in a small circle. At the words, he places his left hand on the altar and blesses both the chalice and host together with the right hand. He then joins his hands and says the remainder of the prayer. At the center, he immediately raises his eyes up to the cross and then makes a medium bow of the body with hands joined, resting on the altar. In this position, he says the prayer, SPSX. When he finishes the prayer, he immediately separates his hands, placing them flat on the altar, kisses the altar, and then turns around to face the people. He separates and rejoins his hands, as he says in the loud voice. The rest of the prayer is said in the quiet voice as he continues the turn, making a full circle back to face the altar. The server responds with the Suscipiat.
Suscipiat Dominus sacrificium de manibus tuis ad laudem et gloriam nomine.
At the Sursum Corda, he raises his hands, keeping them extended. He slowly joins his hands at the words, Gratias, lifting his eyes to the cross as he says the word, and then making a low head bow. The canon is the most ancient part of the Mass and is said with the greatest solemnity. All the prayers of the canon are read from the Missal and said in the quiet voice. Before the priest begins the Te Igitur, he first joins his hands, separates, elevates, and rejoins them as he lifts his eyes to the cross, then bows profoundly over the altar and rests his joined hands on the edge. This entire gesture is made in silence. Only once he is bowed down does he begin the Te Igitur. The first part is said in a profound bow with hands joined on the altar. After the phrase Supplices rogamus ac petimus, the priest separates his hands and kisses the altar. He then stands erect and joins his hands while he says, He then places his left hand on the altar and blesses both host and chalice 3 times as he says, He then extends his hands before the breast and continues with the remainder of the prayer. At the words, the priest joins his hands slowly as he elevates them just below his face and bows his head slightly. He simply remembers those for whom he wishes to pray, then separates his hands and holds them extended for the remainder of the prayer. The communicantes is said with hands extended. The priest makes a medium head bow to the Missal at the name of Our Lady, and then a low head bow to the cross at the name of our Lord. At the conclusion of the communicantes, the priest joins his hands. The first part of the prayer is said with hands joined. The priest then makes 5 signs of the cross, 3 over both the chalice and host, 1 over just the host, and 1 over just the chalice. The third sign of the cross should be made more slowly so that the priest may say all the words, As the priest begins the Qui Pridie, he lightly wipes the tips of his thumb and forefinger of both hands near the outside edges of the corporal. He then takes the host in both hands at the words Accepit panem, holding it upright with the thumb and forefinger of both hands, his other fingers extended and touching at the fingertips. At the words, he raises his eyes to the cross and then makes a low head bow as he says, He makes the sign of the cross over the host with his right hand. He then bows profoundly over the altar, resting his forearms against the front edge of the altar. After the priest has pronounced the words of consecration, he stands erect and moves his hands to rest at the edge of the corporal. He genuflects, looking intently at the sacred host as he does so. He then rises and elevates the host above his head, but keeping it in a straight line above the corporal. He should keep his eyes intently fixed upon the host throughout the elevations, without unduly prolonging the duration of the elevation. It should be a slow but continuous movement. He lowers the host and sets it on the corporal in the center, and then with both hands resting inside the corporal, the priest again genuflects. He then immediately proceeds to the consecration of the precious blood. He uncovers the chalice and rubs his thumb and forefingers over the cup to dislodge any particles of the sacred host as he begins the prayer simili modo. He takes the chalice at the stem with both hands, right over left, making sure to keep custody of the thumb and forefinger of each hand. He elevates the chalice slightly above the corporal he sets the chalice down and makes a low head bow at the words Tibi gratias agens. Keeping the left hand on the stem, he makes the sign of the cross over the chalice with the right hand, as he says, then takes the chalice with both hands, lifts it off the corporal, and moves the left hand underneath the base, while keeping the right hand at the stem just beneath the cup as he finishes the prayer. He then bows profoundly over the altar with his forearms resting on the edge and says the words of consecration. After pronouncing the words of consecration, the priest sets down the chalice, rests his hands on the corporal, and genuflects. As he genuflects, he says the words, he rises, takes the chalice with the right hand beneath the cup and the left hand at the base, and elevates it in a straight line above the corporal, offering it to God as he shows it to the people. He keeps his eyes intent upon the chalice throughout the elevation. He then lowers the chalice, sets it on the corporal, takes the pall with the right hand, and covers the chalice, keeping the left hand at the base to steady it. He then genuflects. The first part is said with hands extended. At the phrase De tuis donis ac datis, the priest joins his hands momentarily, places his left hand on the corporal, and makes the sign of the cross 3 times over both the host and the chalice together, as he says, then once over the host, as he says, he then immediately extends his hands for the next prayer, which he says keeping the hands extended. Before beginning this prayer, the priest joins his hands and bows profoundly, resting his joined hands on the edge of the altar. In this position, he says the first part of the prayer up to the word, quote, quote. At quote, quote, he separates his hands and kisses the altar, making sure to place his hands inside the corporal. He then straightens and joins his hands momentarily, as he says, he lays his left hand on the corporal and makes the sign of the cross once over the host as he says, and once over the chalice as he says. He then immediately makes the sign of the cross on himself as he says, he then joins his hands and says the conclusion of the prayer. He then lifts his head, lowers and extends his hands, and continues with ipsis. At the phrase, he joins his hands and makes a low head bow to the sacred host. The Per Quem Haec Omnia begins with hands joined. The priest then lays the left hand on the corporal and makes the sign of the cross 3 times over both the host and the chalice, as he says, He then places his left hand at the base of the chalice, uncovers it with the right hand, and genuflects. He takes the host in his right hand, holding it at the edge. He then takes the chalice at the stem with the left hand, and makes the sign of the cross over the chalice with the host 3 times, as he says, He then makes 2 signs of the cross horizontally from the lip of the chalice to himself, making sure not to go beyond the edge of the corporal. He then holds the host over the chalice and elevates both a few inches off the corporal as he says the words. He then immediately sets the chalice down, keeping his left hand on the base, and lays the host on the corporal in the center. He purifies his thumb and forefingers over the chalice, covers the chalice with the right hand, and genuflects. He joins his hands and makes a low head bow to the sacred host as he says in the loud voice, He then lays his left hand on the corporal, and with his right hand he removes the paten from underneath. He takes the purificator and gently wipes the surface of the paten. He then sets the purificator to the side, takes the paten between the second and third finger of the right hand, and holds it upright with the concave surface facing the corporal and the edge next to but not on the corporal. He now begins the prayer, Libera nos, in the quiet voice. He makes a medium head bow to the missal, at the words Da propitius pacem in diebus nostris, he makes the sign of the cross on himself with the paten. The left hand is placed against the breast, while the right hand touches the edge of the paten to the forehead, breast, left, and right shoulders. He then immediately kisses the top edge of the paten, and as he says the remaining words of the prayer, he places his left hand on the corporal, and with the right hand slides the paten underneath the host. He then sets the paten on the corporal, uncovers the chalice, and genuflects. He takes the host at the edge with the right hand and holds it with the thumb and forefinger. He takes the host at the edge with the right hand and holds it with the thumb and forefinger of both hands over the chalice. He then says the word as he breaks the host vertically into 2 equal pieces, making a low head bow as he says the holy name. He sets the right half down onto the paten, runs his thumb and forefinger over the edge of the left half to send any particles into the chalice. He says, as he breaks off a small piece from the bottom of the remaining half. He finishes as he sets the remaining half onto the paten. He then takes the chalice at the stem with the left hand, and holding the particle over the chalice, says in the loud voice. He then makes 3 horizontal signs of the cross with the particle from lip to lip of the chalice as he says, He then begins in the low tone the Haec Commixio and drops the particle into the chalice. He purifies his fingers over the chalice and finishes the prayer, making a low head bow at the holy name. He then covers the chalice and genuflex. The priest remains bowed and places his joined hands on the altar as he says the three prayers before communion in the quiet voice. He keeps his eyes fixed intently on the sacred host as he says, He then takes both halves of the host with his right hand and places them upright in the left. He takes the paten with his right hand and places it on the three extended fingers of the left hand underneath the host. Holding the host upright over the paten and keeping the paten above the corporal, he then makes a medium bow of the body and says in the loud voice, as he strikes his breast with his right hand, and then says the remainder of the prayer in the quiet voice. He then straightens and overlaps the two halves of the host and takes them in his right hand. He makes a vertical sign of the cross with the host over himself, careful not to go beyond the edges of the paten. As he makes the sign of the cross with the host, he says in the quiet voice, making a low head bow as he says the holy name. He then bows profoundly over the corporal, resting his forearms on the edge of the altar. He holds the host over the paten, keeping the paten under his chin and above the corporal. He then reverently receives the entire host. He immediately stands erect and places the paten on the corporal. He may purify his fingers over the paten if necessary. He then joins his hands before his face and pauses in meditation until he has swallowed the host. As soon as he has swallowed the host, he immediately begins the prayer, Quid retribuam, in the quiet voice, as he uncovers the chalice and genuflects. He stops after the phrase, Que retribuit mihi, and takes the paten in his left hand. If there are particles visible on the paten, he should purify the paten into the chalice by holding it above the chalice with his left hand and drawing the particles down into the chalice with his right thumb and forefinger. He then transfers the paten to his right hand and scrapes the corporal where the host lay during Mass. He should be particularly diligent in scraping the creases and corners where particles are likely to gather. If necessary, he can lift the edge of the corporal with the left hand. He need not be overly scrupulous in scraping the corporal, but worry only about those particles which are clearly visible. He then transfers the paten to the left hand and purifies it over the chalice as before. He lays his left hand, still holding the paten, on the corporal, and finishes the prayer as he takes the chalice with the right hand, saying, he makes a vertical sign of the cross with the chalice over himself, as he says in the quiet voice, bowing his head at the holy name. Before the priest drinks the precious blood, he should make sure the cross on the base of the chalice is facing towards himself, so that he drinks from the edge of the lip which is immediately above the cross. He then holds the paten under his chin and drinks the entire contents of the chalice, preferably in one swallow. He then sets the chalice on the corporal. When the priest does not distribute communion at Mass, after he has drunk the precious blood, he immediately places the chalice at the edge of the corporal, and the server pours wine into the chalice. He should tip the chalice towards the server, with the cross facing the direction the server will pour, so that the wine runs down the same side that the priest drank the precious blood. The left hand holds the paten, resting on the corporal. While the server pours the wine, the priest says the prayer for the first ablution, Quod ore sumpsimus. He lifts the chalice slightly to indicate to the server when enough wine has been poured. Then, holding the chalice over the corporal, he rotates it slightly so that the wine passes over the entire surface which was covered by the precious blood. He then holds the paten underneath his chin and drinks the first ablution, making sure to drink from the edge of the lip which is above the cross. He then sets down both the chalice and the paten on the corporal, and takes the cup of the chalice with both hands, keeping his thumb and forefinger joined over the cup. He carries the chalice to the corner, keeping it over the mensa of the altar. The server pours first wine and then water over the priest's fingers for the second ablution, during which the priest says the prayer, Corpus tuum. For this ablution, the priest should take only a little wine, but a larger quantity of water. He lifts his fingers to signal the server when he has poured enough. He may bow his head to the server as he departs. He then sets the chalice on the altar immediately to the left of the purificator. He shakes any excess drops from his fingers, takes the purificator with the right hand, and dries his fingers at the place of the cross on the purificator. Once his fingers are dry, they are purified, and he may now separate his thumb and forefinger. He then places his left hand on the altar and takes the chalice with his right hand and again carefully rotates it over the corporal so that the ablution passes over the entire surface covered by the precious blood. He holds the purificator under his chin, makes sure the cross on the chalice is facing him, and drinks the second ablution. He sets the chalice down on the corporal and wipes his mouth with the purificator. He then dries the chalice. He takes the purificator in the right hand and holds the chalice with his left hand as he wipes out the inside of the cup until it is dry. While the priest is purifying the chalice, the server transfers the missal and the chalice veil. The priest sets the chalice in the center of the corporal, lays the purificator over top with the cross in the center, sets the paten and the pall on top, and then moves the chalice to the side and refolds the corporal. first the bottom fold, then the top. The server holds open the burse, and the priest puts the corporal in the burse with the right hand. He then takes the chalice veil from the server and covers the chalice completely. He sets the burse on top with the open end towards the back, and then places the chalice in the center and arranges the veil as necessary. Once the chalice is completely veiled, he then goes straight to the missal and says the post-communion.
Oremos.
He closes the missal with both hands. He then goes to the center of the altar, kisses the altar, turns around, separating and rejoining his hands as he says, he turns back around to face the altar, makes a medium bow of the body with hands joined on the altar, and says the placeat in the quiet voice. After this prayer, he separates his hands, kisses the altar, and then joins his hands at the breast. He then gives the final blessing in the loud voice. He takes the chalice with the left hand, turning it so that the veiled side faces away from him. He places his right hand flat on the burse, makes a low head bow to the cross, and then descends to the foot. The priest and server both reverence the altar. If the sacrament is present, the priest genuflects on the floor. Otherwise, he makes a profound bow. The server then presents the biretta, the priest covers his head, and both proceed back to the sacristy. The server walks in front of the priest. The rubrics direct the priest to recite a short prayer of his choosing while processing. Once in the sacristy, both priest and server bow their heads to the cross. The priest sets down the chalice, uncovers his head, the priest then removes his vestments. There is no rubrical prescription for the manner of removing the vestments, but it is customary to remove them in the opposite order in which the priest put them on, and to kiss the stole, the maniple, and the amice. He should maintain a recollected spirit of prayer until he is completely unvested. He should also make a private thanksgiving after Mass. The server, meanwhile, may tend to the altar. He removes the missal and the altar cards from the altar and takes all the items from the credence table back into the sacristy. Because the water used during Mass was blessed, it should be poured down the sacrarium. The server then covers the altar.